An apothecary who translated Latin medical texts so that the poor could treat themselves. A doctor who cut open a plague victim to understand what was going on. A faith healer so famous that people crossed the country just to be touched by him. And a midwife whose book became a bestseller. These are some of the real people who shaped medicine in Renaissance England. And today I'm joined by Dr. Alanna Skuse, a literary scholar and historian, and the author of The Surgeon, the Midwife, the Quack, to talk about who was practicing medicine at the time and why the line between healer and quack was never as clear as we think. Hey, so hello. Thank you so much for being here, Alanna. I can't wait to talk about your book, gorgeous book that I have here with me. So yeah, thank you for being here.
Thanks for having me.
So, I enjoyed the book so much, and there were so many colorful characters. So, I thought we could start by talking about sort of who got to practice medicine, who got to control medicine, the sort of hierarchy and the competition that existed in the Renaissance in the medical marketplace. And my favorite character probably in this book is everyone's favorite really is Nicholas Culpeper, right? Who
hmm
was this apothecary who translated medical texts from Latin into English, and he became a best-selling author. He became very famous and hugely popular among ordinary people who could now treat themselves at home more easily, right? But of course, that didn't make him as popular with the Royal College of Physicians or even other apothecaries, right? So could we start by talking about Nicholas Culpeper a little bit and sort of what made him so radical and why he was seen as a threat at the same time?
Yeah, I mean, he's an incredibly interesting figure. So if we go back to the beginning of Nicholas Culpeper's life, he is bereaved of his father before he's even born. So he's brought up by his mother in his grandfather's house. And this is important because his grandfather is a churchman. So he brings Nicholas up thinking that Nicholas is also going to go into the church. And that means that Nicholas gets really, really good Greek and Latin education, which will be important later. Nicholas is a bit of a tearaway. He is going to elope with this girl. We don't know her name, but we know he was going to meet her. And apparently, on the way to their secret rendezvous where they were going to elope, she is struck by lightning and dies.
Oh my
Which is,
gosh.
I know, it's a kind of mad twist of fate. And this
It
sort
was
of,
not meant to be.
it was not meant to be. And Nicholas, as you would, takes it very badly. And he kind of goes off the idea of being a churchman. And his grandfather finds out about this elopement, basically cuts him off. And instead of paying his way through university, he apprentices him to an apothecary. So this is how it comes to be that Nicholas ends up in the apothecary trade, but unlike other apothecaries, has this kind of classical learning that means he can translate the Pharmacopoeia Londinensis, which is the College of Physicians' big book that they give to apothecaries, which basically says, here are all the medicines, and this is how you've got to make them. It's in Latin as a bit of a sort of flex by the College of Physicians, because they know that a lot of apothecaries have enough Latin to be able to know kind of what's going on, what they need to do to make these recipes. But not very many apothecaries have really, really good Latin. Nicholas does, so that means he can translate that book. And he makes a great deal of money from translating the book, but he's not content just to do a one-for-one translation. He also puts in there, well, actually, I don't think these medicines are very good. They're very
Mhm.
expensive. They're using these rare ingredients. And actually, you could do this instead, and this would be a lot better. So there's a recipe in there for some kind of poppy water, and it's got all these expensive ingredients in. And he says, he puts in his notes, well, if you do all this, at the end, you will have a very pretty water that is good for absolutely nothing. That's typical of the approach he takes to the translation. So, of course, yes, he's not very popular with the College of Physicians. He's also not that popular with the apothecaries because he's taking custom off them. Um, Despite the fact that he himself is a very successful apothecary, the other apothecaries are worried that he's basically giving people a DIY recipe book
Yeah.
so that they don't even have to go to the apothecary anymore. They can make the things from what they can find, in their own gardens and in hedgerows and so on. So he's always a figure that kind of attracts trouble.
Yeah.
Religiously quite radical. He's very much a Republican. He tries to fight on the Puritan side in the Civil Wars, immediately gets shot in the shoulder and gets sent home. But the thought was there. And he's
Hmm.
just kind of naturally an iconoclast.
And he won't stop publishing, will he? Because there's so many different books. He's involved and he's so young still. And I think it's Peter Cole, right? The printer.
Mm-hmm.
They partner up and then there are just dozens of books suddenly and he's everywhere and he becomes a kind of minor celebrity in a way. And I don't know,
Yeah.
I think he's a very interesting character. He realizes that there's so much that can be done because of the printing press and because more people are reading than ever before, right?
Peter Cole is a really good match for him.
Mm.
They have the same kind of approach to the world, a sort of live fast, die young type of
Hmm.
type of approach. And yes, he just publishes and publishes and publishes. I don't know where he finds the time, but he works himself into the ground, which is probably one of the reasons why he dies so young.
Mm.
He dies age 38. And Peter Cole
Gosh,
doesn't live
yeah.
to make old bones either. Peter Cole actually
Mm.
hangs himself in his kind of bookstore house not that
Hmm.
long afterwards.
Gosh, yeah. But still, we have so much material from him, right? Because he was working non-stop. So I think it's interesting because even though he only lived until he was 38, we do have a lot of information about what medicine was like because of him, right? And all the criticism and success that he attained. So I think he's an interesting figure. But thinking, so he's very much about sort of everyday medicine, right? Kind of
Mm-hmm.
everyday life. But I was thinking about periods of crisis, thinking specifically of the plague, and moving so from Culpeper, who was an apothecary turned author, to doctors, to physicians who largely left London, right, with the when the plague of 1665 started. I was thinking about one of the few who stayed, right, George Thompson, because we know that most physicians left, apothecaries stayed, surgeons left as well. But George Thompson was one of the doctors who stayed, and you mentioned in the book how he dissected a plague victim, right, trying to understand how the disease worked. So I was thinking about practicing medicine in a time of crisis like the plague. What was it like for physicians to or apothecaries to treat patients and yeah, what was that like dealing with people on the ground during the outbreak, the 1665 outbreak of
George
plague?
Thompson tells us, he says in his book that he would often go and sit with plague victims and hold their hand while they died, essentially. So he had a real care for his community and he was very deeply embedded in his own community. That wasn't the case for all physicians. And I think that's one of the things that made physicians leave while apothecaries stayed. You know, apothecaries had their shop on the high street, they knew
Yeah.
everybody in their neighborhood by name.
Hmm.
Um, George Thompson finds opportunity as well as hardship in this period of the plague. So, as you say, he claims that he's survived the plague 4 times.
Mm.
Whether he's actually done that or not, I'm not sure. But yes, he cuts up this youth who's allegedly died of the plague. He then gets the plague again, unsurprisingly.
Mm.
Uh,
Yeah.
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 And he has some really kind of wacky cures for the plague. One thing he says is you can wear gemstones around your neck, which essentially draw out the kind of badness of the plague. But he
Hmm.
does recognize not everybody has access to loose gemstones.
Yeah.
So instead, you can use a toad. And he was very interested in toads. Lots of people were at this time, really strange kind of beliefs around them. And he says if you look at a toad, if you stare at a toad very hard for about 15 minutes, the toad will be so angry about this, it will die. And you can then get the toad. You can either dry it out and hang it around your neck, or you can dry it out and make it into tablets. And basically, the sort of concentrated hatred that is in the toad will do a kind of like for like effect, where it will draw out the badness of the plague from your body again, and that will
Gosh.
be curative. Yeah, so there is, even in the cures that seem really weird,
Mm.
there is a logic there.
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
Thompson uses his newfound status as the guy that stayed in London during the plague,
Yeah.
when the plague is over, he's repeatedly writing to the College of Physicians saying,
Of course.
look, everybody else scuppered.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I think that those physicians should be made to take the cures that they were prescribing for the plague. So
I
basically,
mean, and
yeah,
why do you think he stayed? Was it a sort of business move? Do you think he saw it as an opportunity perhaps to differentiate himself, or was it because he had nowhere to go? I don't know. What do you think were his reasonings for staying?
he doesn't say, but I feel that it was probably ideological in his case.
Really?
He had a very deep conviction in the rightness of what he was doing. So even before the
Mm,
plague, for many years, he'd been talking about bloodletting, and he was a very strong opponent of
yeah.
bloodletting. He was very fiercely for some of the new Paracelsian medicines and kind of chemical medicines. And he was ambitious, but not particularly in a material sense. He didn't ever become really, really wealthy. He just felt very strongly that the status quo was not serving the people who it was meant to serve, and that he could do better.
I mean, which is fair enough. And I guess that if you are treating plague patients and you're not a fan of bloodletting, that's a good thing, right? Because people who are already weakened by the plague, it's not great.
Yeah. I mean, for
Yeah, I
once, the
mean,
College of Physicians got it right, because even the College of Physicians, who would generally look at somebody and let their blood out, they said the plague was an occasion when you shouldn't use the three great remedies of purging and bloodletting and emetics.
interesting. Yeah, that makes sense. And do you think after the plague, after this particular outbreak, do you think that it changed how medicine was practiced in a kind of everyday sense, or do you think things kind of returned to the way they were before?
I think it permanently undermined the authority of the College of Physicians, who'd been
Yeah.
trying for a long time to establish themselves as the arbiters of medical practice. And it had been
Hmm.
going fairly well for them. But people noticed that the physicians left during the plague, and they weren't inclined to be pushed around by these people who left them in their hour of need. So that contributed to the way that through the 17th century, medicine became more kind of pluralized, when we might imagine that it would go in the opposite direction, that everybody would end up being qualified, everyone would end up being in one of these very few organizations. Actually, we
Hmm.
see, okay, the apothecaries are getting their own guild, the surgeons are getting theirs. There's endless attempts to get the midwives into a guild, but the midwives aren't really up for it. Um,
Yeah.
so in some ways, it set medicine back, because some of those other specialties are, largely untrained or trained by experience. But in some ways, it preserved what was good about the medical
Hmm.
marketplace. The fact that you
Hmm.
had people who just did one thing and they were really good at that thing, your bone setters or your tooth
Yeah.
drawers, those people.
Yeah. No, I think that makes sense. And this is something that I found interesting in the book, how you talk about the different kind of practitioners. I think this is a misconception that people often have, that it was sort of doctors and then everyone else kind of like lumped together as quacks. And of course we know that's not true. There are people who were very good at what they did. And you mentioned blood setters, and I think another good example is midwives, right? People
Mm-hmm.
who were so involved in the everyday life of the community and who were so key to so many different things. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about midwives. We know this is the time of Jane Sharp publishing her book and kind of disappearing afterwards, which is a shame
Mm.
because I don't think we know enough about her. But yeah, could you talk a little bit about midwives and how they practice in everyday kind of life? Yeah.
There is this idea that all women who practice medicine at this time are permanently in danger of being
Mm.
cast as a witch, that it's all kind of quite superstitious, and that women's medicine is very low status. And actually, midwives give the lie to all of that, because midwives are recognized as high status members of their communities who have really, really valuable skills. And the field of midwifery is very broad. So, on the one hand, you have kind of, your lady down the street who she doesn't have any training as such, but she's got a lot of kids. And on
Hmm.
the other hand, you've got people like Jane Sharp, who is a professional midwife. She's probably making a good deal of money out of it.
Yeah.
And people learn primarily through experience. That experience can look like an apprenticeship, like a surgeon would have, or it can be, they've just been kind of raised up in one of those households. And the midwives, they have a degree of accreditation. So you can get a bishop's license to be a midwife. You don't have to have one. But if you
Mm-hmm.
do, then you get depositions from a number of other women saying, I know this lady, I've seen her attend X number of births, I know she's an honest lady. Because what the bishops were really looking for wasn't even efficiency in midwives, it was an assurance that they would not conceal a birth. That's really
Mm-hmm.
important. There's a great paranoia about people concealing births, concealing abortions, passing abortions off as stillbirths, or lying about who the father was. So
Yeah.
that's what they see as important in midwives. What women see as important is
Of
obviously very
course. Yeah.
different.
Yeah. But I think that's so interesting. There's such an anxiety because I think midwives have access to this area where men until then are largely excluded from. So they're kind of fearful of what the midwives are going to do with that access and that power, right?
Mm.
So
It's a real
and
female centered space, one of the
yeah.
only spaces that's just women, because the woman kind of goes into labor, goes into confinement, and you have her gossips there, which are the female relatives who will help her. And if the midwife for some reason doesn't get there in time, they may also help her give birth. And you have the
Mhm.
midwife, and it's this very kind of enclosed secret space.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I can understand why men would be apprehensive about it in a way. And moving from midwives to sort of the broad category of quacks, if we could call them that, because I think that's quite a problematic term in some ways. I think we end up putting people together who have very little in common. But one of my favorite people to read about in the book was Valentine Greatrakes. Is that how you pronounce
Mm-hmm.
it? I think. Yeah. So he's known as the stroker, right? Which is quite, I mean, quite a nickname to go by. But he was such an interesting case to read about because he's kind of halfway between medicine and faith healing and celebrity, and he has such a unique story, and he kind of shows up and becomes a sensation and kind of leaves and
Mm.
seems to go on to live a peaceful life. So I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about him and how he came to meet the king, wasn't it? I think he went to, yeah. Could you tell us a little bit about him, this character?
Yeah, I mean, Greatrakes is the most interesting guy, and he's really been the provocation for thinking about my next book as well, because this question of quackery, as you identified, is so vexed and so nuanced. So Greatrakes is Irish. He's from County Arfane in Ireland, and one day he just wakes up and he has this idea that maybe he could heal people of the scrofula, which is a sort of skin disease, by laying hands on them. And he gets a couple of people with scrofula. They come around his house, and apparently it works. He says his wife is quite skeptical when he has this idea. You get the sense that Greatrakes has had a few ideas before. Anyway, it works. And then he starts expanding and he starts thinking, oh, well, I bet I could heal people of other things. And this is now becoming a little bit controversial because, of course, the other person who can heal people by laying hands on them at this time is the king, who can use the royal touch. Um, but on it goes, the local church keeps trying to stop him from doing it. Then it's the regional church. He doesn't take any notice. Lady Anne Conway, who lives near Worcester, has terrible headaches. She's known to have these kind of debilitating migraines, and she gets Greatrakes over. She thinks, let's see what he can do, and he can't cure her headaches. But okay, nobody can cure her headaches, and she's very open-minded. She just lets him hang around her house for a while. People start coming to her house. Then people start coming into the centre of Worcester, and there are huge crowds. It actually becomes a bit of a public order issue. Um,
Hmm.
and Greatrakes is so popular that the king sends for him, Charles II. He wants to
Hmm.
see if Greatrakes can cure this mad courtier who's at his court.
Hmm.
And again, Greatrakes can't do it, but he goes into London, he's in the parks, he's incredibly popular. Apparently, people are so kind of thronging to get near him that some people can't get near him. And there's a lady who, instead of being able to touch him, buys a jar of his urine and most of it she drinks, and then some of it she pours in her ears. And it says this is
I mean, as one would.
yeah. So, I mean, Greatrakes has all the marks of being a quack, right? He does this slightly unorthodox thing. He's attracting big crowds. He doesn't have a premises as such. He doesn't have any qualifications. But for one thing, he's not charging. He is doing this pretty much for free. And for another thing, he has the backing of members of the Royal Society, including Robert Boyle, who are very interested in how this might be working, but believe that he genuinely is doing something.
Mm-hmm.
So it raises this question of, well, who is a quack? Because a lot of what the orthodox medical world is doing does not work. Some of it's actively harmful. So if Greatrakes is also doing something that does not work, but doesn't really do any harm, then who decides who is a quack and who is a legitimate practitioner?
Yeah. I think that's such an interesting question, because when we look at it from the outside, medicine in this period, we kind of see a hierarchy of physicians and surgeons, apothecaries, and then midwives and quacks and bone setters and everyone else. But of course, we also see people accusing each other of being quacks. So it's a bit, it's not that straightforward. And the fact that someone like him, who would look like a quack, would also have the support of Robert Boyle is kind of, where does he fall? And to me, it's intriguing that he doesn't charge, because we know that most quacks are in it for the money. So it's I wonder why. I don't know. Maybe he had family money. Maybe I don't know. It's intriguing why he wouldn't charge people, right?
Yeah, he's got enough money. Lady Anne Conway does give him some money, which he uses to settle some legal stuff in Ireland. But in general, he is, I think, acting out of religious conviction. And that's another thing we forget about people in this period, like George Thompson. He has an idealism to him. We can see these people and see them doing, strange things, things that we think won't work, and conclude that they're just all on the make. And a lot of them are.
Yeah.
But just like now, some people see medicine as a vocation.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's the thing. And it's hard to avoid generalizations, but we probably should. And another thing that I wanted to ask you about was focusing on patients now, because again, this is another thing that I think we get wrong in terms of how this period is represented in TV and films and things. Patients are often shown as being so passive and sort of knowing nothing and advocating for nothing and just lying there waiting for someone to come and let their blood. But as you show in the book, we know that patients were not passive, right? They were researching and looking for the best option. They were talking to their friends and family and writing letters and sort of trying their best to heal themselves and each other, which is, I think, makes sense, because that's what we do as well, right? I think sometimes we forget that people in the past were similar to us in many ways. And so I was thinking, with so many options of physicians, surgeons, barbers, and whatnot, how did people decide, do you think, who to trust? Is it just a question of budget, or is there something else about authority, expertise, or how do you think these aspects relate to each other? How did people choose who to ask for help?
Yeah, it's a complex mixture of budget, social status, personal relationships, and probably a bit of luck. So, officially, the line is that if you are upper class, you go straight to the physician. The physician is an expensive option, 10 shillings a visit for a physician. If you are kind of middling class, you might go to the surgeon first. If you are more working class, you're going to the apothecary or maybe your local kind of domestic healer. In practice, it doesn't always work like that, because we have letters from some members of the aristocracy. There's a letter from a guy back to his wife. They've got a sick kid, and he is saying, get the local midwife out to see the child. She knows much more about children than this fancy physician that we've been using. And there's lots of kind of noble women who are doing domestic medicine and treating their families and also all the people around them. And they're in many cases probably more learned than the local physician.
Yeah.
So it's a case of who you know, what you can afford, a little bit like us today, and what's local to you, because you're probably only going to find a physician in a big city.
Yeah.
Most of the physicians are in London. There are also some in places like Bristol and Worcester. But if you're out in the sticks, there's no way a physician is coming out to you. You might, if
Yeah.
you're lucky, find a surgeon. You're probably not going to find an apothecary. So your options look very, very different.
Hmm. Yeah, no, I think that's the thing. It varies so much, and I think we tend to focus on London because, of course, we have
Mm-hmm.
more sources, but it's so different when you start looking elsewhere. And well, I wanted to ask you as well about misconceptions because I think there's so many about medicine in this period, and I think I have my pet peeves, my list of things that annoy me when I'm watching a film or reading a novel. But I wanted to ask you, to wrap it up, sort of what's the thing that you wish people would stop getting wrong the most? Like, what's the thing that you find most frustrating? Because, I mean, we have plenty of options, and you mentioned the story with the frog, and we know there are crazy things happening, but it's not all bad. And so I wanted to know what do you think is sort of the biggest misconception that there is about medicine in the Renaissance?
I think there's this perception that it's very punitive, it's very harsh, it's almost willfully cruel. And
Mm-hmm.
it's true that in some cases, the disgustingness or the painfulness of the medicine is taken as evidence that it's working. I mean, we still think that now sometimes, but actually, they are taking a very holistic view of health, and we don't give them credit for that because they believe in the humors, because they believe that the emotions and the thoughts and the substance of the body are so interconnected. It leads them to ways of thinking about mental and physical health that we would see as quite forward thinking. So, for example, there's a perception that people who were mad would just kind of routinely be locked up and beaten. But if you actually read texts like Robert Burton's Anatomy of Melancholy, a lot of it looks like today's CBT. They're saying things like, can you make sure they listen to cheerful music? Can you make sure they see their friends? Make sure they get some exercise outside. Don't let them study too much or think about kind of sad books and things all the time. So there is a huge lifestyle component. And when people
Mm-hmm.
just focus on bloodletting, focus on the hanging a toad around your neck or sawing off your leg with no anesthetic, they're seeing the very, very pointy end of the
Yeah,
wedge. And actually, 99.9% of medical practice is
yeah,
happening, you know, in a way that we would recognize. It's people giving their kids, a bit of syrup with sage and rosemary in it for a cold, or having a bit of willow bark for aches and pains. It's sensible things.
yeah. No, I think that's a good point, and I think we have to remember that people in the past were people just like us, and they are all trying their best. And yeah, I think you're right. I think the lifestyle as a major component of how to treat the body is was so key. And I think we're coming back to this, which I find interesting. We're sort of in a way rediscovering that, and yeah, especially where mental health is concerned. And I think that's very interesting.
Yeah, absolutely.
And if people want to follow you and your work and buy the book, where can they go? Where can they learn more about you and your newest projects? I don't know if you can share anything about any upcoming projects.
Yeah, so I've just signed the contract to start writing my next book, which is going to be about quacks.
Very
So
cool.
we're starting with Valentine Greatrakes, then I'm going to think about some other quacks, and I'm going right through to the 20th century, which is really
Okay.
exciting. And I'm also going, my goodness, I have a lot of research to do. But that won't be out for quite a long time. I've got a children's book coming out in September with DK, which is
That is so cool.
a history of medicine. Yeah, it's going to be so fun. It's illustrated, so that'd be great. But you can follow me on Instagram. I'm at historian_Alanna, or you can go and buy the book, which is everywhere. It's on bookshop.org, it's on Amazon, it's at Waterstones. Yes, she's very beautiful. And I think the
It
paperback's
is.
coming out in autumn as well.
Yeah. I love the cover art. I love how you have I'm going to try and show here, but you have the
The little
little
instruments. Yeah,
tool.
it's
Yeah.
great.
Very cool. Okay. Well, thank you so much. And yeah, I really enjoyed the book. And thank you for coming and sharing a little bit about the world of Renaissance medicine with us.
You're very welcome. Thank you.
Thank you.